Good evening, everybody. We're almost done listening to these presentations. I appreciate y'all paying attention to me after listening to all these. Anyway, my name is Tripp Cappelmann. I'm a biology major, and I'm going to talk to you guys about the biochemistry of opioid addiction. So, opioid addiction is a significant health concern, both worldwide and in the United States. It's estimated 36 million people abuse opioids worldwide. There's 2.1 million Americans who abuse prescription opioids, and over 450,000 who are addicted to heroin. And I read an alarming stat that 75% of people who are addicted to prescription opioids eventually try heroin, and 23% of people who ever try heroin become addicted to it. So I love the show Intervention. Does anybody else watch the show Intervention? So I initially became interested in this topic because I was watching that show and I was just intrigued by the power that drugs would have over these people to completely change their personalities and their motivations and cause them to do crazy things and put themselves in crazy dangerous situations and forsake their families and lie and steal and all that just to get high one more time. So it's kind of interesting to me. I've also recently had some personal experience. My younger brother has been struggling with heroin addiction for the past 3 years. So unfortunately I've seen firsthand the things that this disease can do to people. Luckily, as of right now, he's clean and sober and working towards his recovery. So years and years ago, addiction used to be viewed as a fault of the morals of the addict itself. They looked at it as a series of bad decisions that led to harmful events to the loved ones of the addict and to the addict himself. We now know better than that. We know that it's a legitimate disease with physiological changes in the brain that lead to very strong compulsive behaviors towards achieving their drug of choice. And like many other diseases, it's preventable, it's treatable, and certain groups of people are more susceptible based on genetics and their developmental environment. So we're talking about opiates. There's basically two types that are abused. You have your prescription painkillers like Oxycontin, Vicodin, hydromorphone, things like that. And then morphine and its derivatives like heroin. I'm going to focus mainly on heroin and morphine just based on time constraints. But you can see in the picture they have very similar structures. So what these substances do is they take advantage of our body's natural system for blocking pain and rewarding certain behaviors. So a main component of both of these is the Mule Receptor, which it's a GPCR, it's a gram protein coupled receptor, which means that it's a transmembrane receptor with 7 transmembrane alpha helices. And it's also bound to 2 G protein subunits. And this slide is really busy. I really just want to focus on the structure of the Mule receptor and talk about a couple pathways. The first is the opening of this potassium channel and the closing of the calcium channel, which leads to a hyperpolarization of the cell, which blocks the propagation of pain signals in the body. But it also decreases the cyclic AMP cycle, which eventually leads to dopamine release, and I'll talk more specifically about that in the future. And so this picture was just really cool looking, so I want to include it. It basically shows the same thing. It's showing the hyperpolarization of this cell, and you see the decrease in the amount of cyclic AMP over here with the opioid bound in this state and not in this state. So in this natural system that our body has to block pain signals, it uses what are called endogenous opioids, or opioids that are neurotransmitters that we produce within our brain. An example of this is an endorphin. Has anybody ever experienced a runner's high or heard of a runner's high? A second wind when you run them, you feel good. This is caused by our brain releasing our natural opioid endorphin, which binds these same mu-opioid receptors, blocking pain and eventually leading to the release of dopamine, and causing a feeling of well-being and happiness. So you can see that the structure of morphine at the active site is similar to our natural endorphins. And this functional residue is tyrosine. So it basically mimics the structure of a natural endorphin to induce these changes. So there's a lot on this slide that we don't need to pay attention to either. So I'm going to talk about heroin and morphine interchangeably a couple times, and this is why. Because morphine is basically a metabolite of heroin. So heroin is hydrolyzed to morphine in the brain, and morphine is its active form. So heroin was invented in the late 1800s as a possible treatment for morphine addiction. But unfortunately, its structure made that not possible. So you can see the two acetyl groups on heroin instead of the two hydroxyl groups on morphine. This makes heroin more lipid soluble because of the hydrophobic interactions, and this causes it to cross the blood-brain barrier more readily, causing a higher concentration of the active form of morphine once it enters the brain. And so this shows what happens when an opioid binds this Mule opioid receptor, causing the dopamine release. So binding of the Mule opioid receptor inhibits the release of GABA, and GABA inhibits the release of dopamine. So when we're inhibiting this GABA, we're causing a neighboring cell to release more dopamine. And with our natural endogenous opioids, there's negative feedback mechanisms to control this from going haywire. And these are the kind of things that cause us to feel full after eating a big meal. So drug addicts, they don't feel like they're satiated after taking drugs because this negative feedback mechanism is passed by the drug mechanism, and so they just feel great because there's 2 to 10 times more dopamine released with synthetic opioids than with our endogenous opioids, and they just continue to want to do more and more and more. All right, so there's a couple different areas in which opioids are so addictive. The first is psychological addiction, and I touched on this earlier, but we've adapted this as human beings. We've adapted this natural reward system that rewards certain behaviors that are important to sustaining life, like sex and eating and drinking water, things like that. And they're found mostly in the limbic system with a few other structures involved, like the hippocampus, and the amygdala is also important. So when drugs bind the Mule opioid receptors in the VTA, or the ventral tegmental area, this causes a release of dopamine to the frontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. So the frontal cortex is involved in focusing of our brain's attention. So this causes our brain to focus on what's going on, it being high levels of dopamine because of exogenous opioids present. And then the amygdala is important for our processing of emotions. So the high levels of dopamine sent to the amygdala tells us, this is awesome, I really like this feels really good. And then the hippocampus is involved in taking short-term memories and turning them into long-term memories. So it remembers this awesome feeling because of all this dopamine, because of all these drugs, and it takes it and it transfers it into long-term memories, which is an important aspect in long-term behaviors of the addict. So this can bring back specific memories of a situation or cause triggers that may cause them to relapse. Even after years and years of abstinence from the drug, it's still present. So the other aspect of addiction is physical addiction. It induces tolerance and physical dependence and withdrawal symptoms. So I talked briefly about the mechanisms of the opioid receptor in the neuron cell. So what it does is it hyperpolarizes the cell, which makes excitability harder to stimulate, and it inhibits adenylate cyclase, which inhibits the concentration of cyclic AMP which is important to protein kinase A, which has really important downstream effects, including the phosphorylation states of many transcription factors in our in the cellular genetics. So, over chronic use of the drugs to compensate for the downregulation of all these pathways, our bodies, in trying to maintain homeostasis, has to upregulate the cyclic AMP process in order to maintain a normal level. So the addict is left needing the drug to feel normal, and then if the drug is removed, there's intense withdrawal symptoms as the cyclic AMP is amped up, causing GABA to be released at very high levels, which inhibits the release of dopamine. So there's no dopamine to make them feel good, and so they experience withdrawal symptoms like flu-like symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, and severe depression. And it's been studied, and it's been shown in some studies that these altered phosphorylation states in the genetics of the cell of these transcription factors cause long-term changes that may never be able to be fixed. And so, they say once an addict, always an addict, and this is genetic proof of that. And this is what makes it so tough to quit even after years of stopping the drug. So there's some medical treatments that go along with the behavioral treatments that have been used for years and are notoriously ineffective. 65% of addicts in treatment relapse after 3 months, and 75% relapse after 12 months. So hopefully these drugs can help to stop the relapse behaviors and get these people clean. So methadone has been present since the 60s, is an agonist, but unlike morphine and heroin, it lasts for a long time, so its effects are attenuated over 24 hours. So it blocks the withdrawal effects while not giving the addict this kind of high. There are also partial agonists of the mu opioid receptors, like buprenorphine is in a drug called Subutex, which also binds partially and allows for the blocking of withdrawal symptoms while not allowing the high. But these are both daily medications, so the efficacy is difficult because you have to have an addict going out of his way to purchase medications in order to stop his addiction. Opiate antagonists have been around for a while. Naloxone, which is used in treatment of overdoses, because its affinity for the receptor is higher than the actual drug. It blocks all effects, and there's actually a month-long injection of this that addicts can get, which hopefully will improve the efficacy and improve the chances that these addicts have of getting clean permanently.
Time.
The end.